Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome a regular and much esteemed speaker on Blogging Theology, Dr. Louay Fatoohi. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, Paul. It's always an honor and a pleasure to appear on your outstanding channel. And thank you very much for inviting me back.
Great to have you back. For those who don't know, Louay is originally from Baghdad in Iraq, and he reverted from Christianity to Islam in his early 20s. He has a PhD from Durham University here in the UK and has published extensively on Islamic studies and is particularly interested in comparing historical accounts in the Quran with their counterparts in Jewish, Christian, and other sources. He's also interested in comparative Abrahamic religions in general and tafsir, which is Quranic exegesis, the historical Jesus, and Sufism. He's recently published a book on that as well, which inshallah we will discuss on a separate podcast. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Blogging Theology Academy. Now, a few weeks ago, Louay, you published a very hard-hitting article, which I read on Facebook. I don't know where else it's been published, but it began as follows. I'm just going to read the first paragraph by way of introduction. And you write the following: my wife and I moved to the UK 1.5 years after the first Gulf War. In our new homeland and the West generally, Iraq and its people were reduced to a caricature, Saddam Hussein. The economic sanctions that devastated Iraq, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, according to UNICEF, were framed as sanctions against Saddam. Bombing Iraqi sites, even post-war, was similarly marketed as targeting him. This was a stark example of othering, where an entire nation was effectively erased and replaced by its dictator. Now, that's the end quote. Now, this is an extraordinary article, which I will link to in the description below. Do have a look at it. Today, Louay will be sharing with us a review of the Iraq War from over 2 decades later, based on or inspired by this article, and considers the lessons to be learned, stressing its relevance to understanding what's happening in other parts of the world. He argues that it's an example of what should never be allowed to happen again. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, this is really something very close to my heart. I come originally from Iraq, as Paul, you mentioned. Just kind of simple background, personal background. My wife and I came to the UK in 1992, as you said, about 1.5 years after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which took place on the back of Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. My wife was actually had a position. She was originally a professor of physics in Baghdad. And when we came, she went back to Durham University, where she had done her PhD in the past, and she was doing research there. I started doing my, with a particular professor at Durham, doing research on historical astronomy. And obviously later on, I did my PhD as well there. So we lived six years in Durham, beautiful Durham, amazing Durham. Yes. And then we moved to Birmingham. We moved to Birmingham after I finished my PhD. My wife, Shadam, moved took another position at Aston University. So we lived basically much of the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq, apart from a couple of years roughly. We were in Iraq there. We lived the first Gulf War, but the rest, what happened afterwards, since after the middle of 1992 until the Iraq War in 2003 and what followed, there were things we observed at a distance. Obviously, we had and we have relatives and friends who live in Iraq who are affected by what's been and what happened there. So this is just little kind of background on where we come from. Now, the case, as you mentioned, Paul, quoting from that little post on Facebook, the case, the war on Iraq, is really, I mean, if I were to describe it very briefly, I would call it a large-scale, international, multifaceted crime against humanity. That's what I would call it. it has had devastating, lasting consequences. And as you say, is really an extreme case of Western othering of other peoples and nations. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to present a critical review of the case for the war, the occupation, and the aftermath of the war. I will be reviewing things kind of in historical context, but beyond that, I am, as I'm pretty sure most of your viewers are interested also in presenting an Islamic perspective on what went on there. There's a lot to learn from what happened with Iraq. It is a specific case study, but the lessons are broad, are interested, should be of interest to anybody who's interested in the ethical, political, moral health of the world. Anybody who's interested in the world order, or maybe more accurately, the world disorder. And also it really one case study of a chronic illness of Western culture, which we may call historical amnesia. The West lives and has lived and continues to live in historical amnesia, in which it forgets what it's done and always forces us to live in the present. And when you live in the present, and any historian will tell you that you can't understand the present without understanding the past. The present is always a product of the past. The only one exception, I should mention this, of a major case of a crime against humanity that the West doesn't forget is the Holocaust. And the reason it's not forgotten because there has always been concerted effort to keep it in the collective memory. So everybody knows about it, and rightly so. The question is why the exact opposite is done to other cases of crimes against humanity committed by the same people. You know, I'm talking generally speaking, using the term West here. And obviously one of these cases is Iraq. And you know, what we're doing here is effectively to counter that kind of attempt to sideline the story, to basically make us forget it, because there's much to learn from what happened. Yeah. So to go back to that little post I wrote, it's about when we came to the UK. Obviously, you know, unsurprisingly, we heard all kinds of things about Saddam, about Iraq. Some of it is correct, some of it is incorrect. But the one thing that I really was shocking to me, and obviously to my wife, is this condemnatory description of Saddam as somebody who kills his own people. Now, that was supposed to be a description about Saddam. What I think people who use it did not realize that it kind of unintentionally revealed a lot about what I would call the West's moral bankruptcy. Because because we knew that Western leaders and their policies killed in Iraq a lot more people than Saddam killed. I mean, some estimates put Saddam's victims at 150,000, huge number. 200,000, maybe 250,000. You know, estimates differ.
I mean, Iraq is not. So Iraq is not a big country. It's not like United States of America or Russia or Canada. I mean, this is a huge number proportionate to the population of Iraq itself. So we think, oh well, it's not big, not a big number compared to the population of America, but proportionately, it's a smaller country. It's a huge percentage of the population. And one could not even begin to imagine if a similar proportion of people in the UK had been killed, or a similar portion if we're American, or Americans have been killed, how that would have affected us, our consciousness, our memory. Actually, I can't, because it's beyond my capacity to imagine what the effect it would have had on us. But nevertheless, I mean, I just wanted to stress how enormous these figures are.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good point, putting it in the context of the population, it really is a huge number. Most people would have been affected, would have known somebody who was affected, who was a victim. And you remember, we're talking here about those killed. We're not talking about those, put in prisons, forgotten about, etc. There are all kinds of people. But to put things in perspective, the people, the Iraqi peoples who were killed as a result of the war, one estimate put that as around 600,000. 600,000. There are different estimates, but that's one estimate. But the number of lives destroyed, not necessarily as a result, being killed, but they having their lives completely thrown out of course, being made destitute, turned into just beggars effectively. You're talking millions. You are talking millions. There isn't a single Iraqi who doesn't know many people who suffered one way or another as a result of the war. They would tell you about people they knew who were killed, imprisoned unfairly, made destitute, turned into, from really good living into miserable life, turned into beggars, etc. Everybody has all kinds of stories. Bush, George W. Bush, Tony Blair, and others who took part in this massacre, the huge massacre, are never described with a similar condemnatory description as those who kill other people. That is not something you hear. Even though they killed so many Iraqis, that did not qualify them for anything like that. Saddam, however, he is the special evil dictator who killed his own people. Let's put this in slightly kind of another context. The Israeli politicians, Netanyahu, let's say, for instance, has been killing Palestinians for fun. Thousands and thousands of them, targeting them, including children, women, elderly people who can't do any damage to anybody in Israel, outside Israel, etc. But he was been targeting them. But nobody had come out and said, oh, I'm talking about Western media, mainstream media, to give him any special kind of butcher-like title. No, because these are Palestinians after all. They're not his own people. But if a Palestinian politician, leader, warlord would have done what Netanyahu had done and has been doing, he would have joined Saddam, Bashar Assad, other those people in earning this specially vested title that the West somehow have actually managed to create and not realize what it also says about them. What I found also quite shocking is that obviously a lot of mainstream media bought into the stories that were being told about Saddam, Iraq, etc. But there were also a lot of good, excellent critical journalists. What amazed me is that even those journalists, many of whom would question all kinds of things, really take politicians to task about all kinds of claims, they still used this particular description without realizing what they are actually doing, just making this crime of killing someone's own people as worse than killing others. So what we're talking is about, it's an attitude of othering foreign victims into insignificance, into nothing, into inexistence. When you talk about them as foreigners, they don't count. They are nothing.
It's also the fact that from a British or American perspective, these people are not white. I mean, to be brutal about it, there is a racial element to this, and I think that still is the case today. When we look at the way Ukrainians are treated very sympathetically and invited into our homes in the UK, refugees, and the way the Palestinians are treated. The big hullabaloo a month or two ago when a couple of Palestinian refugees managed to slip through the net and get into the UK, and there's a big outcry about it, objecting to this. So I think race is there in the background. It's not explicit, of course.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't be doing it openly, but nevertheless, it forms the background mood music, I think, of things.
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of things, really. It's ethnicity and it's religion as well.
Yeah.
Because obviously we have a lot of fundamentalist Christian, Jews, etc., who also part of this international power game. So now the war wasn't the war that started in 2003 wasn't the only time or the first time when Iraq was subjected to this kind of really massacre of innocent people, because the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq, economic sanctions, which were imposed in 1990 after Iraq invaded Kuwait, illegally, of course, took over Kuwait. So sanctions were imposed on Iraq, but the sanctions were extremely draconian. I mean, they were intended basically to stop Iraq from developing weapons of mass destruction, rebuild its military machine, etc., all of that. But really, it was used politically, in particular in the UN, when Iraq was put in a position where it had to get permission, approval from a UN committee for anything it imports. And then a political game was played by the US, in particular, but also by Britain and France, whereby everything was subjected to all kinds of delays, rejection, etc. And it was ridiculous to the point that things like pencils that you use at school were accused of having potentially dual use, which means that because of the graphite, so it could be used in whatever, apparently nuclear bomb or whatever, so they would be banned, or, you know, some basic really goods that Iraq needed. That particular, those sanctions resulted in the death of not less than 500,000 children died as a result of that. And to give you an example about how those foreign victims do not count, do not matter, and their lives is worth nothing. Madeleine Albright,
I was just going to mention
who was the permanent
her name. I was thinking, are you going to mention her name? And you are.
Yeah, well, how can you forget her?
Yeah,
I mean, this is like as saintly as it gets. So Madeleine Albright was the permanent representative of the US at the UN. In 1996, she was asked on a program on CBS about whether she felt the death of 500,000 children, Iraq children, was worth it. Her exact words were, "The price is worth it. The price is worth it." It was this kind of, this cold, callous, inhumane reply. In 2003, just to cite a couple of examples, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, people can search and find many others. General Tommy Franks, he was the commander, the US commander of the invasion. He was asked to comment on the casualties of the war. His exact words were, "We do not do body counts." Just think about it, how the human lives were being reduced into these cold, callous descriptions, and how the emphasis is clear and uncompromising. We don't care. They don't matter. They're worthless to us. Of course, anybody who knows anything about American history knows that America was built on genocide and ethnic cleansing. Iraq is much farther from home. If that history can be forgotten and set aside, the history of how America was built, well, how difficult would it have been to actually dismiss the case of Iraq, which is a foreign country after all. And indeed, if you want to also kind of generalize what happened, Western wealth, civilization, Western wealth and material well-being was built on the colonization and brutalizing other nations. Now, this is how the West behaved and continues to behave. Let's look at this from an Islamic perspective for comparison. Look what the Quran says and how different it is from the instances and the history we've been talking about. This is one verse from the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. من أجل ذلك كتبنا على بني إسرائيل أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فساد في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. It's maybe translated as, because of that, we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul, as in a retaliation for a murder, whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or corruption committed in the land, it is as if he had killed all people. And whoever saves one, as in one soul, it is as if he had saved all people. This is from chapter 5, verse 32, for anybody who would like to check. Now, as you can see here, the Quran is completely indiscriminate in its justice, in its kind of assessment of a human life. A human life, in general, any life is the same, equally important, equally respected, and equally has the same rights. And I want to here compare that verse with a similar passage from the Mishnah or the oral Torah. The Torah, or the Hebrew Bible, was given. It's believed it was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, but he was also given oral revelation. So the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, Talmud contains the Mishnah and also some commentary called Gemara on the Mishnah. And this particular passage comes from a tractate called Sanhedrin. It's chapter 5, passage 9, for those who would like to check it out. And I'm going to read it from a particular translation, and the source is the Jerusalem Talmud, and the translator is Jacob Neusner, is well-known scholar. And it goes like this: whoever destroys a single Israelite soul, note the emphasis here on an Israelite soul, is deemed by Scripture as if he had destroyed a whole world. And whoever saves a single Israelite soul is deemed by Scripture as if he had saved a whole world. And look at the difference between these two. Now, which one is likely to reflect the immutable, unchangeable divine principle of justice? The biblical, the Mishnah, or the Quran? Which one is likely to have retained the original revelation? Which one you feel naturally inclined towards? One that gives special value to the life of a person who belongs to a particular ethnos, or one that treats all people equally? And of course, the situation with Jewish scripture is obviously, it's not only the Mishnahs, only this particular passage. This kind of focus on ethnic Israel is kind of dominates all Jewish scripture, the Mishnah as well as the Hebrew Bible. I'm just gonna cite one example here, which deals with the concept of usury, taking kind of interest. And this comes from Deuteronomy chapter 23, passages 19 to 20, and goes like this: you shall not charge interest on loans to another Israelite. Notice the focus: to another Israelite. Interest on money, interest on provisions, interest on anything that is lent. Now look at the contrast. On loans to a foreigner, you may charge interest, but on loans to another Israelite, you may not charge interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings in the land that you are about to enter and possess.
So what was the reference in Deuteronomy again? For that
23, 19, 20.
23, 19 to 20. Thank you.
This is NRSV, by the way, the translation.
Oh, yeah, that's the gold standard.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Yes, so you can see the difference. Of course, everybody is familiar with what the Quran says about usury. It prohibits usury for everybody. There's no exception for those who aren't Arabs, Muslims, non-Muslims, etc. It's just an indiscriminate ban, period. And of course, what happened is that Christianity because it accepted the Hebrew Bible as scripture. It kind of adopted that, but it developed it, changed it slightly from ethnic Israel to spiritual Israel. But that does not, the problem is, if you accept this kind of language, this kind of theology, you cannot escape its consequences on your thinking, on your behavior. And it's not only a matter of kind of peaceful, kind of racist, let's call it ethnocentric theology. No, it comes with some extreme violent of othering, because that's a form of othering. If you're not an Israelite, you are being othered. And in my view, it inspired Israel's genocide today. In fact, Netanyahu, as we know, did quote the Hebrew Bible, in particular certain passages, violent passages, when he was talking about the Israelites, about the Palestinians. And I'm going to quote just two short passages here. One of them from Joshua 6:21, and goes, "Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys." Another passage.
It always mystifies me what the Bible's problem with donkeys is. I mean, what is the excuse, really? That we need a theology of donkeys to explain why they are a legitimate target for extermination. Personally, I'm completely ignorant about the theology of donkeys. Maybe someone can enlighten us.
I was going to make a similar joke, because there's a second passage I'm going to share now. Again, for whatever reason, donkeys also feature prominently.
Well, but clearly there's some dark secret about them which we're not aware of, and that must be the reason.
There must be. There's no question. It could not have been just an absurd mention, of course. It must have some theological, profound meaning. Indeed. So this is from 1 Samuel 15:3. And this goes like this. Now, this is God instructing the Israelites. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel, and, you guessed it, donkey.
Well, they are thoroughly bad characters. No, I mentioned this passage yesterday at Speaker's Corner, a disreputable place I know. I did go to a Christian. He's a very, decent Christian, educated person. I said, "You do realize the God in the Bible orders genocide?" He said, "Oh, no, it doesn't. And I said, "It does." And I actually quoted from memory this passage, 1 Samuel 15, because I know it by heart. And he said, "No, it doesn't say that." I mean, I had to actually get out the Bible and point it. And he just didn't believe me. I mean, he was in complete denial. And this is not the only passage. You quoted the passage in Joshua, and there are other passages in Deuteronomy where extermination and what we would call genocide of entire nations is allegedly commanded by God. And of course, this is picked up by Netanyahu in his dog whistle speech, where he referenced the Amalekites as well, referencing the Palestinians. Exactly. So this is not just a bit of Old Testament scholarship. This is as contemporary, daily relevance to a lot of people in the world.
Yeah, that's why I personally, I'm always open to all kinds of, people can believe whatever they want. People believe in multiple gods, no God. They believe in idols. People have they've been given the freedom to believe whatever they want. And most of these concepts, most of these beliefs are, neutral. They are just concerned people. They have implications theologically, but in terms of you're living in this world, you don't really care. Lakum dinukum wali dini. You have your own religion, I have mine, as the Quran says. But in my view, this particular concept, this othering in Jewish theology is extremely dangerous concept. It actually encourages, supports, and can very easily tip somebody from living peacefully with others to immediately justify extreme forms of just violence against whole people completely indiscriminately, because the language does not differentiate between people. Therefore, just goes for everybody, basically. I've seen at times people, when you raise a point like this, they come back, often people maybe atheist, or they will suggest, oh, every religion has this concept. of othering. I said, no, wrong. These people are wrong in the same way the guy who argued with you yesterday was wrong. Islam does not have this concept of chosenness. As you know, Paul, we've done a program on BT on this concept for those who are interested, but I also wrote a detailed, expanded technical paper for the Yaqeen Institute for those who would like to go and read about it. The Quran does not have a concept of othering. It does not exist. Nothing like that. So for those who would like to pursue this any further. Back to Iraq. So we came to the UK, and then we suddenly we were struck by the image of Saddam there. Saddam being presented as somebody who's, and that's the issue here, completely evil, completely evil. There's nothing positive about him. Some of what was being said about him is obviously correct and true and accurate. Some wasn't necessarily. So Saddam, let's just make sure that we know our facts. Saddam was a brutal dictator. He was a butcher of people. He killed anybody who not necessarily moved against him, but he perceived that could develop potentially into an enemy. He would go for them. So he killed at times preemptively before people actually tried to do anything. And but you have to remember, if you did not kind of form any danger to Saddam, you could live safely there. So it's not like he was going around on the street just killing anybody for no reason. It wasn't like that. Within days, within I think a week or two of him kicking the president of the time, he was his deputy, and taking over as president of Iraq, within a few days, within a week or so, he purged a lot of people from the Ba'ath Party, people whom he thought maybe did not agree with him taking over, etc. And it's actually something that was recorded, shared by members of the party, etc. But today you can actually see it on YouTube. And like I say, he was really pretty brutal. I should say here, my future at the time, future father-in-law, I wasn't married at the time to my wife, was killed by Saddam himself. He was a retired army colonel. He had no involvement in anything against Saddam. One day he was picked up from home, and the next day they heard on the radio that he had been executed. So they had to go and pick up his body. He's actually mentioned in, there's a book that was published in 1982, but by Saddam's brother, who was the head of the intelligence, Iraqi intelligence. In that book, he recounted, according to him, 8 attempts of assassination attempts to kill Saddam. And this was the one in which my father-in-law was mentioned as one of them. Now, I don't know whether it was real. All the details involved, the people was real. It's possible, but I'm citing it as an example that I know somebody who was not involved at all, and he was just basically, I don't know why he was brought into it, and he was killed. Now, one thing, another kind of folly that's attributed to Saddam usually, and is the Iran war. In my view, Iran war probably was unavoidable because the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran was bent on exporting its revolution, and Iraq was next door. Iraq is, which hosts a lot of Shia shrines that Iranian pilgrims would come to, etc. So I'm not sure Saddam can be completely responsible for the war against Iran, but he was definitely responsible for the occupation of Kuwait, invasion, occupation, and that invasion of Kuwait was actually the real beginning of the destruction of Iraq, because that started the sanctions. The sanctions themselves developed into leading ultimately to the war in 2003, the consequences of which we still live today. That all is really pretty damning picture of Saddam. But Saddam wasn't only that. Saddam also had some positives. To be fair, he was, during his reign, Iraq eradicated illiteracy. In fact, UNICEF considered Iraqi campaign one of the best campaigns in the developing world in the eradication of illiteracy. The healthcare system that the Ba'ath Party, Saddam, called whatever, developed was top and was completely free at all levels. The education system, completely free, high quality. I benefited from it. I didn't pay a single penny. I finished my undergraduate studies, of course, in Iraq. You were guaranteed employment. Social services were really, really good. There was a salary for widows, orphans, disabled people, all kinds, the kind of information that people in the West had no idea. Nobody would be interested in that. It's not that nobody would have heard, but they wouldn't be willing to share this information because the focus is on just talking about his evil acts, his evil personality. But the reality is that it was a mixed, he was a conflicted person, put it in this way. And obviously the economy was actually quite thriving, even during the war with Iran. So I think what I'm trying to say here is a balanced assessment and fairness is needed when we talk about anybody, good or bad. We have just to be fair to them. And I might share another anecdote here to see the difference between ignorance and between ignorance being a choice. When we came to the UK, we were obviously at Durham University. Durham has and still has a collegiate system like Oxford, Cambridge. So we lived there. We had a little flat. My wife and I lived there, and then we were members of so-called senior common room where you mix with other staff, etc. You see them, you have breakfast, lunch, dinner with them. So you come to know them. There was one particular gentleman who was a postdoc at Durham. And one day I was chatting to him. He asked me about Iraq. And obviously when you talk Iraq, you talk Saddam. And I started talking, and I tried to tell him that, look, Saddam is pretty brutal and he's this bad, but he also wasn't all bad. He also did the following. Unfortunately, the guy got really angry at me because I told him something that he did not want to hear. Because Saddam is evil and should be just be evil and stop there. We shouldn't actually try to be balanced in our view. Now, obviously, providing good social services doesn't mean that you're okay killing people. Of course, it doesn't mean that. But as a historian, as history, as facts, as reality, you have to say both. You have to say he did this and he did that. It's pure, facts, nothing more than that. Mm. Now, look at, again, let's go back and look at this situation about how Saddam, or obviously other dictators that the West doesn't like, are presented or misrepresented at times. Let's look at what Islam teaches us and look at the superior, far, far superior teachings of Islam. I'm going to cite two beautiful, immensely beautiful verses from the Quran. They are about the same subject, but each of them has a different emphasis, and you will see the beauty of the kind of the difference in emphasis here. This is the first one. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O you who had believed, stand firm for Allah, witnesses in justice, as in be witnesses in justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just. That is nearer to righteousness. So the verse is reminding us, even when you have hatred between you and some people, you still have to be fair and just to them. This hatred is one of the most powerful emotional response we may have towards others. Not even that. Not even. We're not allowed to meet that emotional need by painting the wrong picture of these people or treating them in any form of injustice, whether it's about any issue. Even describing them or attributing something to them that's not true is, of course, is a form of injustice. So this first verse talks about people, effectively enemies, let's call them, people where we have hatred with. The second verse does the opposite. This verse, the second verse, very similar, but this focuses on people who are close to us. And look at what it says. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم والوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا. O you who have believed, stand firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves, parents and relatives, whether one is rich or poor. Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not your personal inclination, thus failing to be just. So what this verse says, by the way, the first verse was from chapter 5, verse 8, for those who would like to check it out. This verse is chapter 4, verse 135. Now, the first verse was talking about people whom we have hatred, we have enmity towards, people we don't like. This is the exact opposite. This is saying those whom you like, who are close to you, relatives, etc., it's warning us about giving them preferential treatment in an unjust way. So it kind of balances both. You can't be unfair towards those who are your enemies, whom you hate, who you have all kinds of difficulties with. Equally, you can't be unfair with those who are close to you, those who are your parents. He says even وَلَوْ عَلَى أَنفُسِكُمْ, even yourself. You have to be fair. And that balance is amazing. That what the Quran said 14 centuries ago. It was, as everybody knows, this principle, this instruction, this commandment, well ahead of its time. But it remains ahead of time today, because we're talking about modes of behavior everywhere in the world that falls well short of upholding this principle of justice. We're talking about othering. We're talking about supremacy. We're talking about racism. We're talking about all these nasty, evil concepts, dogmas, ideologies. And look at what the Quran says. So that commandment, that advice was to the ancient Arabs, to the first Muslims, to Muslims in general, but to all people today. The world would do much better following these two verses than following anything that the West or otherwise teaches about justice. Only these two verses are sufficient to draw from them a whole legal system that which protects, maintains, and looks after the rights of everybody, everyone, young and old, poor and rich, close and far, white and black, just about everything, Muslim, non-Muslim, Jew, Christian, anybody, because they do not discriminate, they don't distinguish between people. One thing that really important point I always make in relevant discussions, which is we're talking about verses that were revealed 14 centuries ago, and comparing them with where we are today, much later in the history of man. And there's something really very important to keep in mind always. History, people, the way people behave, the values they develop, etc., they do not always progress. They also regress. It's very wrong to think of history as kind of a straight line going north all the time, being better and getting better. That is not the case. Human history does not tell us that. Human history is chaotic. Human history goes ups and down, and it goes in all kinds of direction. Today, where we stand today in 2025, if you look at what's happening in Palestine, morally, ethically, in terms of justice, fairness, etc., the world is in a much worse place ethically in terms of any values than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because it allowed something so terrible, horrible to happen. And in fact, not only to happen, but with a huge number of countries, people, organizations, groups, etc., individuals promoting and supporting what's taking place. So then something really very important to keep in mind. Unfortunately, we humans aren't always getting better. At times we actually get worse. That happens, by the way, individually and collectively. So any individual can get better, can get worse over time. So the point here is there's rarely anybody, any individual, any nation, if you like, which is, or he is, or she is all good or all evil. It just doesn't exist. That's not the real world, unfortunately. Now, it's true, some people are a lot more good than they have bad things, and others are the exact opposite. That's, of course, true. But the point here is that something we have to remember, something to also apply in all walks of life, with relatives, with even, I'm talking, for instance, scholars. Scholars actually have to follow this principle. You may disagree with somebody big time, but even that scholar is not, you're likely to learn from them. They're likely to have some really brilliant ideas, some insight you never thought of, even though a lot of what they say maybe you disagree with. That's a fair way of looking at the world and looking at people who are close or far from you. Another kind of description, kind of language used in the West, in Western media, and by Western politicians, is that we are against dictator X, but not against the people of dictator X. So that's, you find this all the time. But the reality is everything that is done in the course of implementing this perception or this claim of us being against dictator X is actually carried out against the people of dictator X. It does not target only, it's not like it's an individual assassination attempt at the life of Saddam. So when the sanctions were put in place, the sanctions were imposed on whom? You guessed it, on Saddam. The reality is that Iraq was treated, the Iraqi people, as collateral. And in the course of supposedly punishing Saddam, it's kind of destroying people in order to destroy Saddam, if you like. And there's one anecdote I heard. I don't know how actually real, as in happened, or just people mentioned, but it, knowing what we know about Saddam, I would not be surprised if it happened. I heard that when the UN secretary at the time, Kofi Annan, visited Saddam at one point in order to talk about WMD, all that thing, he actually invited him for dinner. And he had a huge feast for him, all kinds of food. And then he told them, that's what I eat every day. And you can see what the sanctions have done to me. And what he's trying to tell him, it's not me that the sanctions have hurt. Because like I say, they killed at least 500,000 children, 500,000 child. So that's the kind of devastating effect. And we aren't even talking about the war yet. Now, let's move to talk about the war itself, because there are tons of lessons from how the war was developed, what kind of evil enterprise. Now, this war was completely based on lies, as in the justification for the war. But there's a background to this that we need to cover. After the Gulf War in 1991, when Iraq was kicked out of Kuwait, the Iraqi army was devastated, really, and destroyed. But the Americans, of course, stopped short of occupying Iraq. They left Saddam in power, and they withdrew. Some people in the US administration did not like that, and they regretted not changing the regime. A year after that, in 1992, an organization called Iraqi National Congress was formed. This is consisted of some opposition individuals who lived in exile, and they were supported by the CIA. That, as you can see, that what happened with the Kuwait started this perception that Saddam has to go, but there was nothing formal about that. Just some people sounding the idea and trying to seek and garner some support for it. And then in January 1998, a letter was written by a group from they call them the Project for the New American Century. This was signed. This is a nasty, nasty organization, and it was signed by some really names like Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, John Bolton, Richard Armitage. One, the most pernicious group of people, the kind of people you really don't want your fate to be put in the hands of. They wrote this letter to Clinton at the time, asking for the elimination of Saddam, that Saddam cannot stay there. Within 4 months, the Congress approved the so-called Iraq Liberation Act in May 1998. This was a formalization of US policy of regime change in Iraq. Not much happened in the meantime. However, things changed completely after 9/11. In fact, on the same day this terrorist attack took place. On the same day, or maybe same day, second day, I think on the same day, the Paul Wolfowitz, who was at the time Under Secretary of Defense, so the deputy of Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, formed a special intelligence office in the Pentagon. The purpose of this special office was simply to establish a link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, and also to find evidence that Iraq can continue to develop WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Now, what's interesting about this is this. Wolfowitz was second person in the Pentagon. The Pentagon had its own defense intelligence agency, massive organization, as you would expect. And then the USA has also the CIA. Wolfowitz bypassed both of these to form a new little secretive office of intelligence, because neither the CIA nor the Defense Intelligence Agency had any evidence that Saddam had any link to Al-Qaeda, or indeed any proof of WMD. But that wouldn't work for Wolfowitz and those other similar people in the US administration. This particular little office, it was small. They did not have enough resources. They were not in a position really to check any intelligence the way intelligence reports are usually checked. And then they relied on Iraqi exiles, notorious really Iraqi exiles, who fed them with lies, the kind of lies that somebody like myself, not really a politician or knew much about what's going on in the Iraqi government, but sitting there just on the terms of common sense, I could tell you that this is nonsense. Nobody would actually believe that. And somebody would bring them evidence. Where this evidence came from a taxi driver, an Iraqi taxi driver. We are talking this kind. And then this office will actually take it, develop it into something, then feed it to Bush and the people, Dick Cheney, or the vice president, these people, and obviously suddenly the Bush and his other people, senior people in his administration, started to talking about the clear evidence of link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, that of course did not exist. They cited reports all wrong, all been refuted, and some of at times they also reused them even after they were proved to be wrong. So there was nothing really to it. The head of the team that was inspecting WMD at Iraq, his name is Hans Blix. His position was that there was no evidence that any WMD was developed by Iraq or existed in Iraq. They couldn't account for some missing material, etc., but there was no evidence. They couldn't find anything actually there, because a lot of things was destroyed in the war itself in the 1991. Iraq destroyed afterwards some of its own weapons, etc. And also to cite something that George W. Bush said about 6 months before the war itself, to justify the war in Iraq. And he goes something like that: after all, this is the guy who tried to kill my dad. So the most powerful person on the planet is making a case to destroy a whole nation and spend tons of millions of billions, trillions of dollars, etc., because of how he felt about his dad. Now, the assassination attempt that he refers to supposedly happened in Kuwait in 1993. I don't think actually is genuine, but regardless, even if that was the case, it's completely absurd, of course. And I mean, the fact that we have to bring in the, say, mention in the same sentence the word Bush and intelligence sounds quite ironic, really. But that's actually what Bush was selling to the American people: intelligence. Brilliant. And then the war started in 2000, on the 20th of March 2003. The Iraqi army was completely exhausted, no motivation. Obviously, they hated Saddam, didn't like him. It was massively underarmed, and it was quickly defeated. In the aftermath, no WMD were found. And the explanation for how come that a lot of people, politicians, etc., actually came to the same conclusion that there were weapons of mass destruction, etc., we started learning about a new term called groupthink. Apparently something called groupthink. It sounds like something like a virus or something affected a lot of American and British politicians. And as a result of groupthink 2003, they effectively, we had the war. So what we're left with really is to choose between believing that US, UK politicians are either morons, complete morons, or liars. The choice is between these two. There is no third choice. Either you're led by morons or you're led by liars. Which one is worse? I honestly couldn't tell. They're equally bad. So, another kind of aspect of my personal experience. When we came to the UK, I came from a country state that was under dictatorship. And I know what it means to live under dictatorship. One thing you knew when you're there is that the media is state controlled. You can't really publish anything. There is no kind of private media, private newspaper or whatever. There's nothing like that. It's all controlled. If somebody published anything that's out of order, they would disappear immediately. And Iraqis, everybody who lived in Iraq, knew that, of course, that it's all state-controlled media. So when you read the news, when you watch the news, you always process the news with this in mind. So you know what's being said, and you try to allow for the fact that everything is controlled here. When we came to the West, to the UK, what I noticed is that because the media is not controlled by the state, there's this kind of impression that is superior, and the reports are more accurate because they are not controlled by the state. What a lot of people didn't realize is that there are other forms of control on the media. There are special interest groups. There are people who own the media. I mean, at some point in the UK, if I'm not wrong, Rupert Murdoch, who's Australian, is not even British, owned as much as, I think, 37% of the media. I don't remember whether that was all newspapers and television or whatever, but basically that figure I remember very well, 37%, one single individual who's not even a British.
Yeah.
So the media is controlled. If it wasn't controlled, we would not have seen this absurd reporting on Iraq and the kind of absurd lies that, I mean, I remember in the British Parliament, I think part of the evidence presented to the Parliament to approve the participation in the Iraq war it was actually a PhD thesis, I think, by an Iraqi student. The thesis was presented even pre-proofreading. So it was full of mistakes, grammatical mistakes. We were talking this kind of nonsense. Anyway, so again, from my personal experience, I remember when I was in Iraq, I wasn't kind of watch the news every day, but I still had interest in the news. I remember, for instance, reading about the Northern Ireland problem in the UK. They will show you some reports every now and then, the IRA, the police, etc., what was going on. And I never at any point remember that I was thinking, oh, I know the solution to this problem because I've seen a few reports. When I came to the UK, I noticed most people had solutions and believed they knew what was happening in Iraq and knew how the problem had to be solved. The kind of arrogance and the kind of overconfidence and illusion of knowledge that I wasn't aware of, and I did not have personally, about the UK when I was living in Iraq. I came to the UK. Now I see people every day who talk about Iraq with complete confidence in terms of what they know is happening and what should happen. Common people, whether people we met at the university or others we met outside, common individuals you spoke to, they sounded as if they have personal conflict with Saddam. It was so passionate. It was so it's really bizarre. It really is odd that they felt this close to knowing, understanding, and being so angry about Saddam and what should happen. Here, I would like to quote a beautiful saying by great companion Imam Ali bin Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the fourth caliph, of course. This is from a sermon. Usually, it's named after one of his students, one of his companions, called Kumail. And in this, he divides people into three groups, and it goes something like that. I'm going to say it in Arabic for those who would like to kind of check it out in Arabic. الناس ثلاثة فعالم رباني ومتعلم على سبيل النجاة وهمج رعاع أتباع كل ناعق يميلون مع كل ريح لم يستضيئوا بنور العلم ولم يلجأوا إلى ركن وثيق. So he goes on to say, people are divided into three groups: a learned scholar of God, a learner on a path to salvation, so the second group, and then the third group, common rabble, followers of every demagogue, swayed by every wind, not illuminated by the light of knowledge, and without refuge in a firm pillar. Now, this also reminds us, of course, of the one, or at least one Quranic verse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ لِلْحَقِّ كَارِهُونَ. Most of them hate the truth. And that is description so powerful, not only in the context of talking about the misinformation and disinformation about Iraq. It's really general. And obviously these words were said some 1400 years ago. Look at how true words, live forever. They remain true. And just in confirmation of this, the Pew Research Center, in one of its polls about 6 months before the war, so October 2002, it found that 66% of Americans believe that, quote, Saddam Hussein helped the terrorists in the September 11th attacks. The question here, where did those 66% Americans get this belief from? How did they, what convinced them to do that, given that the case is so absurd? Remember, they were not talking about something really complex here. It's absurd as it can get. The evidence that was presented to them, to the Americans, etc., just complete, so poor. The Washington, this is even worse, it gets even worse and better. The Washington Post, in a poll, this time 6 months after the war, so that was 6 months before the war, the Pew Research Center, this is six months after the war, September 2003, found 7 in 10 of Americans continued to hold the perception that Ba'athist Iraq had a role in the September 11 attacks. Around 80% of Americans suspected Saddam of providing material support to Al-Qaeda. 6 months after the war. So the lies really live long, very, very long. And those who would like to be fed lies will never be satisfied and will continue to eat them all the time and recycle them if need be. And of course, this problem that's happened at the time, that actually Imam Ali spoke about 14 centuries ago, is even worse now with the social media and the internet. Because the problem is that you have a lot of people who have managed to set themselves up as authoritative sources of information. In fact, we have something called influencer. Apparently, if you are influencer, regardless of how you became influencer, etc., you can influence people about all kinds of things. And also, because of the nature of the internet and social media and the fact that we're people getting used to learning and developing knowledge by reading a one-liner, because of that, there is no interest in reading, and any really substantial understanding of any serious issue cannot be done by reading a couple of passages or a short WhatsApp message. This is just nonsense. Unfortunately, it's something that is consuming a lot of people now, and they're unaware of that. They think they are learning, and by just looking at a couple of things somebody sent, most of the time you don't even know who sent it. All these sources also are embedded, so you don't know actually who's saying this. So I think it would be fair to say today people are kind of almost proactively choose to be misled by the way they consume what the media says. So that was the case for the war. Complete lies, nothing to do with reality. Now the war has started. So what happened? Now Iraq now is under occupation. About a year before the war, in April 2002, the State Department commissioned something they called the Future of Iraq Project. It was actually a good move because that was intended to look at post-war Iraq rebuild. So because it was, America was confident that Saddam is gone. So what's interesting here is that it's 1 year before. So all attempts that were made later to convince, to avoid war, it's all nonsense. It's gone. The war had already been signed off. Everything else was a bit of an act, a show. So that report was intended to look after Iraq once Saddam has been toppled, the war is over, and you need to build a nation. So it was Future of Iraq Project. And when Saddam was toppled and Iraq fell to the occupying forces, the Americans brought in somebody who retired, Lieutenant General called Jay Garner, and he had actually a very good positive kind of view of what to do to Iraq. He approached it in a kind of civilian mindset, and he wanted to use the Iraqi army to rebuild Iraq. This is an army that used to, building bridges, all kinds of things. So he wanted, and it's a huge army, and that's a good way of using Iraq, but using the army. But he actually was left in this position for only 3 weeks. He was heading something called Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. So you can see the name is clearly about rebuild, about post-war. But he was replaced pretty quickly in May 2003. Remember, the war started in 2020 March, ended before the middle of April. So within a month or so, 3 weeks, there was a new authority was put in place called the Coalition Provisional Authority. An ambassador called Paul Bremer was put at the head of it. It was given absolute powers, legislative, executive, judiciary, all kinds. They could do anything they wanted. Because this appointment was by the Pentagon. And what happened? The Future of Iraq project and all the planning that was done for post-war was pushed aside. And suddenly Iraq became a battleground between the State Department and the Defense Department. Because Iraq was at war, and we were talking army in control, it was the Defense Department agenda that actually took over. And now this Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, started issuing orders, and now the proper destruction of Iraq at a different level started. The first one was the military destruction, destroying the Iraqi and its Iraq's military machine, the army. Now we're going to move into a completely different level. On the 16th of May 2003, the CPA issued order number 1. It called it the de-Baathification of Iraqi society. It meant to get rid of all senior Ba'ath members. So what it said is that it kind of picked the 4 highest kind of top levels of rank in the Ba'ath party, and it banned those senior party members from any public office and working in the public sector. And that is around 30 to 40,000 people. And also, it picked all top management layers, 3 management layers, in all kinds of ministries, affiliated corporations, institutions, etc., including universities, all kinds. In those top 3 management layers, it added to the senior party members other more junior party members that cannot hold any positions in those institutions. So in this kind of stroke of a pen, the CPA, the occupying forces, eliminated leadership and management skills and experience everywhere from the public sector. And suddenly, no plan how to replace those people. Now, admittedly, some of these people, a lot of them were, let's say, senior in the party. But actually, there were tons of people who were senior in the party. The reason these people were in this position, often because they actually had the experience and they had the skills, but they were also members of the Ba'ath party. And if you replace them and you get rid of them, who's going to take over? They will go. There's no training, there's no succession plan for somebody to be put in place, etc. Immediate vacuum of skills, leadership and management skills in a country that has already come out of war. Who's going to manage all these institutions? Nobody knows. But things got even much, much worse. Within a week, exactly 7 days, the CPA issued order number 2. This is called dissolution of entities. It dissolved 3 ministries, all military organizations, the army, the police, the intelligence, the border guards, paramilitaries, obviously, and all others like presidential departments. Also, they were all disbanded. Suddenly, the fact you've just come out of war, you have no management leadership in public office, and suddenly you don't have law enforcement agencies either. No police, no army. Suddenly, Iraq fell into complete lawlessness. When Donald Rumsfeld was asked about the looting that ensued as a result, he started talking about freedom. When people have freedom, they make mistakes. And that's what the Iraqis were doing. And I always, when this started happening, I remember telling friends, people I used to talk to, and tell them this. This is 2003. And I used to say, look at Britain, how safe it is. And I'm going to ask you one question. Imagine tomorrow in the news, everybody hears and reads that there will be no police, no army, no law enforcement agencies. What do you think would happen on the streets of Britain? What would happen? What would the thieves do? Criminals, organized criminals, drug dealers, what would they do? Would anybody be safe? I mean, we all lived in, was it 2010, 11? You remember probably, Paul, the looting we had in the UK with the police, with etc., everybody around, and we had all kinds of problems. So what I'm talking about is how the occupation treated Iraq with complete disdain, complete contempt. No one serious, no one in their right mind would do what the CPA, what the occupying forces did to Iraq. The Iraqi army, I think, was estimated to be around 300,000 strong. So within days, effectively, within that little order, made all these people unemployed. A lot of these people were career soldiers. They did not know anything else. They did not know, they didn't have any other trade, no other source of income. Within days, armed resistance started to appear in Iraq. Some of these people realized suddenly Iraq under America, the new Iraq, had no place for them. Compare this with the original vision of the State Department, which wanted to employ the Iraq army, effectively move it from focus on military effort to rebuild the country, which is, what anybody reasonable person would think is really brilliant idea. No, they were made redundant, unemployed, with no prospect of making a living in a country that's already moving quickly into complete and utter chaos. Let me give you another example about the contempt and disdain and the othering with which Iraq and its people and its civilization was treated. When the American forces moved into Iraq, they heavily guarded the Ministry of Oil, because it's Ministry of Oil. Not a single soldier guarded the Iraq's National Museum. It contained the greatest collection of Babylonian, Sumerian, and Assyrian antiquities. Not a single soldier. As a result, looting took place. I think figures I've seen confined now, because some of the looted pieces were recovered, but 33, I think, major pieces were lost, and between 8 to 18,000 artifacts lost. These are invaluable pieces, invaluable. Another example of the complete disdain for the occupied people in Babylon, the historical site. US and the Polish soldiers built a base there that damaged a very famous, massive historical site called Ishtar Gate, historical walls and structures, because it's the army. That's what the army did, US and Polish army. The point I'm trying to make here, Paul, is to show how the claim about we are interested in Iraqis and the interest of the Iraqis and the well-being of Iraqis is another lie in the endless chain of lies that started the war. Iraqis are another othered people. That's what they are. No more, no less. And they shouldn't be really any worse than others. They're not worse than the Palestinians, for instance. People of Afghanistan, Syrians, Libyans, you name it. What about the Yemenis? All kinds of people. No difference. Now, the occupation did not find that sufficient. Obviously, the destruction has to be given yet another dimension. Sectarianism. So, as you know, Paul, I come from a Christian family. I lived with my family. We used to go to church. We used to practice as Christians many years. We lived in areas that are really, our neighbors were all Muslims. At times we were the only Christian family on the street. Maybe there's another one. But you wouldn't. So when we rented a house, we didn't have a house. We used to rent. It wasn't like my parents would go and check who's going to be our neighbor and look for a house in a Christian. No, there's nothing like that. So we lived always our neighbors. We had good relations with them. They respected us. We respected them, etc. No issue whatsoever. And yet, before the war started, one of the damaging claims made by the US, British politicians, Western media about Saddam is that Saddam was pro-Sunnis, anti-Shias. And because Shias were the majority, this situation had to be reversed. It had to be not necessarily reversed, but fixed. The very claim obviously promoted sectarianism. The reason the claim was made is very simple. Because the Americans thought, well, there's a majority of Shias there, we can actually win over the people by making that claim. But there's another agenda there, another reason for that. The Americans wanted to seek help from Shia militia. It was actually in operation at the time between Iran and Iraq. So they would enter Iraq, attack the Iraqi army, go back into Iran, this kind of thing. There's one particular well-known and notorious militia called Faylaq Badr, Brigade of Badr. It developed later into, it became later mainstream kind of militia after the occupation of Iraq. But anyway, so the Americans wanted this. This was the agenda of claiming that Saddam was pro-Sunnis, anti-Shias, and that this had to be fixed. That was completely untrue, that description of Saddam, that sectarian propaganda, because Saddam was your kind of ideal proper dictator, let's call. He was against any threat, Sunni, Shia, atheist, whatever you are. To give you an example, Saddam was really anti-Salafis. There are people who would think twice before going to the mosque, twice a day, or maybe for the Jummah prayer into consecutive Jummahs, Fridays, because everybody knew that the security people would be monitoring who goes in there. These are Salafis, they're not Shias. So Saddam was actually against any form of too much religiosity, if you like. He wasn't religious himself, or well, he pretended to be religious, but he wasn't really. And he was more of an Arab nationalist leader. That's what he was. And he was a brutal. I mean, I spoke earlier about my father-in-law. He was a Sunni, he wasn't a Shia. He was killed, and he was a Sunni, he wasn't a Shia. But that is the kind of damaging dimension to the war, and something that the occupying forces did to Iraq. They introduced in 2005 something formally called al-muhasasa, or apportionment, which meant all public offices had to be apportioned to reflect ethnic identity, religious identity. So it's no more, so it's a democracy, but it's not about policies. No, it's about identity politics, basically. And then what you ended up with, now Iraq has always, its president is a Kurd, prime minister is a Shia, and the head of parliament is always a Sunni. And then looking at every other position, all these senior positions in government, they are dealt with in the same way. This is Shia, this is Sunni, this is skills, experience, etc. Political programs don't really come into the picture. It's become an intrinsic part of Iraqi society. What it resulted in, situation that's incredible. We had displacement and eviction of whole religious communities from one area to another, because this area has to stay only Shias. A lot of Sunnis had to leave. So what they do, you would wake up one day and there's a banner or graffiti on your walls, on your fence, saying leave within 24 hours or we will kill you. And what you do is that you either have to leave it quickly and leave everything there, or sell at any price if it was your property and go and live anywhere. And this is somebody everybody knows about. Now the question is here, Iraq never had this before, never ever. It was a secular, actually, in the way the government run the country was completely secular, had nothing to do with sectarianism. Now, sectarianism is completely and utterly embedded in Iraq. Iraq now is completely under Iranian control. It's completely under the control of Iran. So, the case for the war was built on lies, complete lies. And there was already a decision made to get rid of Saddam and occupy Iraq. After the occupation, immediately, Iraq was destroyed, its infrastructure destroyed, its structure it's as a society, it was destroyed. Post-occupation now. So the Americans obviously left at some point. They were going to leave. They maintained the presence, but ultimately in 2011, I think, is the official kind of time when they left. Unfortunately, what they left behind, what I call post-occupation, is it's false sovereignty, but genuine sectarianism. It only replaced the old occupier with a new one. It used to be the Americans and their client kind of state of Britain. Now you have Iran. And in fact, Iraq has become more of like a client state of Iran. If the West was fearful of Iran, well, good luck. You've got two Irans now. Politicians and the clerics are completely and utterly under Iranian control and influence. Iraq is an extension of Iran. Defeating Iran through sanctions, whatever, has become more difficult because Iraq is actually open field for Iran. So it can export, import, etc., can do whatever it likes. And obviously, Iraq fell also under total control of Shia parties and militia, and continues to be the case. Corruption is widespread. That resulted in incredible poverty in one of the most and wealthiest countries in the world. Government positions, highest positions in government, are sold, auctioned, and apportioned, of course. Briberies are everywhere. You can't get anything done without paying somebody. And at times they are a chain of people. So you would go to get some official document and you have to pay. And you ask why this much? And they would explain to you plainly in your face, because I will then have to pay X, Y, Z. And they tell you all the people that will have actually to be paid of that money. Complete openness, you may call, Paul. And utilities, power, water, completely damaged infrastructure. The the high quality education system of Iraq is completely gone. Iraqi degrees, university degrees are difficult to say this, but it really is, it's worthless, really. The quality of education is very, very poor. Iraq used to export lecturers at all levels, teachers at intermediary schools, etc., and university professors to everybody in the Arab world. The healthcare system, almost non-existent. Welfare services have gone. That's what the post-occupation Iraq is like. That's Iraq today. Let's just take a step back now. There's a very, if you think of what we just reviewed, the lies that led to the war, the mismanagement, and the disastrous consequences of these kind of concerted efforts, and they were concerted efforts, in any walk of life, in any domain, people become accountable, are held accountable for what happened. In a democracy like the UK, in British democracy, for instance, at times a minister would be forced to resign for as simple a thing as a leak in his government. They would resign, they have to resign. But what we spoke about, the case of Iraq, and remember this, not only Iraq, we're talking about Iraq, but you can actually use as a case study and look at other case studies, exactly the same thing. War criminals are left without any accountability, absolutely none, because the victims are foreign people. They are people with no rights. So Tony Blair gets knighted. He's Sir Tony Blair now, despite this history of killing, taking part, active part, proactive part in killing hundreds of thousands of people. These people are celebrated for their statesmanship when they retire, when they leave office, and when they die. The powerful and those who have control would never want to be accountable, of course. They want the authority. They want the responsibility, but not the accountability that comes with the responsibility. In an atheistic, this worldly version of reality, this situation cannot be addressed and fixed because this is intrinsic a human injustice. This world was, is, and will always be unjust. The powerful, those who are in authority, who have the weapons, who have the control, etc., will continue to behave in this particular way. Nothing will change them. Those who believe that we have this world to live in and this life to live in, and there's none, they have and must feel as depressed as possible because we will always live in that endless form of injustice. That's not the case from the Islamic perspective. Islam deals with this and all other forms of injustices because it looks at this life as only one short life that's followed by a longer eternal life. One verse, and there are many verses that I could quote here, one of them from Surah Yasin, chapter 36, chapter 12. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. Indeed, it is we who bring the dead to life and record what they have put forth and what they have left behind, and all things we have counted in a clear register. So everything we did, everything we will do, is all in a book, in a record that we will be reminded of. Now, somebody might want to be as unfair and just as they like in this world. and they can escape it. And many of them will escape it. Most will escape any form of justice. Some of the names we mentioned are looked at today, and they lived the best of life, and they died with all kinds of credits and tributes paid to them. But they should wait for the tribute that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pay to everybody. That's the real tribute. That's the everlasting tribute. And that's the tribute that counts. Mm-hmm. So that's for those, I say this to those who believe in this world, and when they look only in this world and there's no other life, no afterlife, I remind them if this is actually what they think makes sense in a world that is full of meaning everywhere. Is this actually compatible with this meaningful world where meaning permeates everything we see around us in life? Now, one pretext that was mentioned to justify attacking Iraq was the introduction of democracy into Iraq, getting rid of the dictatorship. That became the main theme after the occupation. When WMD was not there, everybody accepted Iraq had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. So when Blair or Bush would be reminded, it was false pretense to start and conduct the war, they would just shut down that argument and say, yeah, but we got rid of Saddam, and look at Iraq now has democracy. Now, I am not against democracy, but I am against the idealization and misrepresentation of democracy. The exporting of democracy to Iraq in this case is no different in my view from the Iranian policy of exporting its revolution, of Islamic revolution. So Iran wanted to export its Islamic revolution to Iraq and others, and the West wanted to export its democracy. Both of them through violence. Both of them through violence. And I kind of meticulously chose this comparison with the Iranian kind of agenda and project of exporting its Islamic revolution, because it's kind of the West finds it repulsive, and I just want to make sure they realize how repulsive, equally repulsive, to try and export democracy in the way it is usually done. Democracy, of course, and that's the other problem, is a form of government in which state power is vested in the people of the state. That's really the most basic definition of democracy. So democracy is a government system. It's like monarchy, it's like dictatorship, etc. It is, and that's important, it's ethically neutral. It's not a system of moral values. So even when you have democracy and you go for democracy, it is just a way of government, a method, a system of government. It does not come packaged with any ethical, moral values. That's why democracies, and we see it today, a very kind of rife, fertile ground for wokeness. What is wokeness? Wokeness is the lack of fixed, principled, moral values. They don't exist, and which is why we always, everybody, wherever you turn your face, woke. That's what democracies shout at you. Also, and I want really to go through these about democracy, because it's very much linked to the theme we're talking about, but it's also broader kind of points about how the concept of democracy is usually oversold and kind of misrepresented. By definition, the actions of any democratic state reflects and depends on what the people of the democracy are like. Let me kind of make some stark statement here to kind of explain what I mean. If you had a majority of a population that is supporters of genocide, that democracy will produce genocide. If you are a prime minister of a country, the majority of its people supports genocide, ethnic cleansing, if you are properly democratic, you have actually to do a very good job in conducting genocide and ethnic cleansing. So democracy is not intrinsically concerned with the human rights. Not intrinsically. It could be, but not intrinsically. Democracy has national remit by definition, but it's actually applied internationally. It produces national democrats that become international dictators. For the Iraqi people, Bush is an international dictator. He is no different from Saddam. The Iraqis did not vote for Bush. The Iraqis did not vote for Blair. The people who decided to kind of make a decision on what Iraq and Iraqis should be like. So national democrats can often, and they do often, become international dictators. A democracy, or the system, democratic system in any countries, does not change the fact that the powerful controls, exploits, and kills the weak. And we're talking about the weak, the other people. Democracy, on top of that, is compatible because it's a non-ethical, not unethical, non-ethical. So it doesn't come packaged with any ethical system. Democracy can be also compatible with corruption. I mean, look at the political dynasties that we have: the Kennedys, the Clintons, the Bush, etc. Look at corruption in terms of politicians can always fall under the influence of big corporations, foreign interests. Think of the Jewish lobby, the Israeli lobby in America, for instance. The biggest democracy in the world is India, or that's how it's described. Its mark on the Transparency International, which is a mark of corruption, it's ranked as 96 in that table. It's the first biggest democracy. Now think of the persecution of Muslims in Kashmir, in India, and other parts actually of India, because of the government there and the policies it promotes. Democracy can be also friendly to supremacy and racist ideologies. Look at the history of support for South Africa, racist South Africa. Look at Trump. Look at Trump himself. And also, democracy can bizarrely be very friendly with dictators and dictatorships. And look at the support of democratic countries for Middle East dictatorships and dictatorships in South America historically. Also, democracies have a history with conducting and carrying out crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, all of that. Colonialism, military or cultural, was done by democracies. The proof, failure and corruption of democracy everywhere, the latest proof is Donald Trump. This vile character is the head of the most powerful democracy in the world. Just to mention again, this is not a statement against democracy. This is just to remind everybody, the democracy itself is not intrinsically ethical. It's just a government system, and that's all. And it's the history of democratic states is not necessarily cleaner and better the history of dictatorships when it comes to other people, foreign people. Finally, Paul, there's a lot really that I can go through details, historical. I think I covered the main point, but I would like to end with kind of, because I've reviewed and I've been talking about what the kind of how the consequences of othering and how those powerful states, governments, politicians, etc., did to Iraq, and they continue, and they've been doing to other states and their other countries and other nations. I would like to say it is important that we understand the kind of genesis of these miseries, of these catastrophes. But also, it really is important not to wallow in victimhood, because it's very easy for me, for other people to look and say, oh, look at us, what has been done to us. That doesn't help much, for a very simple reason. Those people who committed what they've committed, they aren't going to change. They will go, but a new generation of like-minded people will take their place. The Quran talks about some of the wrongdoers, and it uses in more than one place a description says, تشابهت قلوبهم. Their hearts are alike. In another verse, it says, أتواصوا بذلك? Have they advised each other? So it's looking at those kind of across centuries of wrongdoers. They do the same. These are wrongdoers, just as if they advise each other. So these people will not disappear. They will always be there. It's really, ultimately, there are things we can't control, individually and collectively, but there are things we can and we should. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in one verse, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah does not change the condition of the people until they change what's in themselves. So this is also a reminder to all of us that we should really think of how to get ourselves better, so we don't be in a position that we have such a sad story to recount. So changing one's self first before thinking of changing others. I think I've covered really a lot here, Paul, but I'm happy to go into more detail about anything else you think I've left out.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating exposition about your personal story, the history of Iraq, and the wider global situation, the Western colonization and influence still. And it is shocking to hear that Iraq is still in this terrible state. And I know America wants to contain Iran, and yet its invasion, occupation of Iraq is simply, from an American point of view, made things worse, because now you have Iraq controlled by Iran. Politically, religiously, as you say. So the whole thing is backfired for everyone, not just for the innocent people of Iraq who've been massacred, but for America's own perceived interests as a quasi-imperial power in the world, wanting to control everything, of course. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of things we could talk about, but I think that is enough to meditate on and reflect on. So thank you very much. I will link, as I say, to your original article, which perhaps inspired this, in the description below. Very interesting article, very concise. So I do recommend people have a look at that. And inshallah, next time we will talk about your new book on Sufism, which promises to be fascinating and controversial in equal measure. So look forward to hearing your explanations of the Sufi understanding of Tawheed, of oneness of God, and so on. I've yet to read the book, of course, but inshallah, maybe after I've looked at it. So thank you very much indeed for your time and your expertise and your extraordinary insight into your own past and present as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Thank you very much.